Welcome to the next couple of minutes in which I will intuitively explain Markowitz portfolio theory. And I'll do that starting with the global investor. A global investor is someone like you or I who can theoretically invest in every asset there is in the world. For example, I can buy shares in different companies and receive dividends, or I can lend those companies money and receive interest and later my principal back. Or I can invest in foreign exchange. Or in buying vending machine or in education, in building a house. Bottom line is there are infinite possibilities or investment possibilities. But the interesting thing is not how many or what kind of investment opportunities there are, not in Markowitz portfolio theory, but how does the investor decide in which asset to allocate his money? So Markowitz portfolio theory asks, how does a global investor decide in what to invest? And if you or if I am the global investor, how would I decide in what to invest? I would form an opinion about those different assets regarding the return or the risk that's associated with them, and then I would make my decision based on that. That's what I would intuitively do. So I would start by theoretically take the first asset, maybe a share in BMW, and let's say that's my opinion. Just for the sake of argument, not really my opinion, but let's say I assume that my expected return for the next year will be 8% or is 8% for BMW. And I think the risk is so-so. And then I go take on the next asset. Let's take Commerzbank. And I think, this bank is a bit less return, but the same risk. Next, Coca-Cola, I think return is a bit less, but risks also little, because even in economic downturn, people will still drink Coca-Cola, and I will keep doing this with all the assets there are. So, but what does it mean if I say, for example, BMW, my expected return for BMW is 8%? What does that mean? It means that I don't know. I don't know what the share price will be in 1 year from now. Nobody knows. But I have an opinion about this. It's my expectation, and my expectation is that it's 8%. On average, depending on all the different worlds that theoretically can appear in 1 year from now. So I could theoretically live in a world where Corona will still be having a big negative effect on the economy. And if this world realizes, then I will receive a return not of my expected 8%, but a loss of 15%. Let's just assume that this is really what's going to happen in this kind of world. And if there's not a Corona world happening, but if there's a world, let's call it business as usual world, and in this world everything will go back to normal, and I will therefore receive a return of 10%. Or if we will be living in a world where a very good manager is leaving the company, then I will only receive a 6% return, or if I have a scandal, then I will only receive 4%, and so on. So there's different returns here, depending on which kind of world will materialize. These are actual real returns once those worlds have materialized, compared to my original expectation of 8%. But how did I come up with this 8%? In theory, I'm the global investor. I make all these assumptions about what kind of worlds can exist, and then I also put a probability on this kind of world. So I don't just say I identify all these different possible outcomes of worlds and take the average, because these different worlds, in my opinion, they also materialize with different probabilities. So, for example, I think that Corona world will be with a probability of 8%. The highest probability will be that we will go back to normal. Let's assume let's assume that this is my opinion here. So, and now I can take the average of all those returns, the weighted average, rated by this probability. So I will say minus 15% times 8%, 10%, 82%, and so on. And that's the thought experiment that lies behind this expected value of 8% that I threw into the room initially. And if I look at all those different worlds, I realize, actually, the return that I will be realizing in all of those worlds, it varies a lot. If I live in a Corona world, I will make a loss of 15%. If I live in a world where there's a top seller, I will make a plus 50%. So I see that in this particular share, the return, depending on the different worlds, seems to be very volatile. Whereas if I had plotted maybe the returns of Coca-Cola, they would have not been as volatile. So no matter what would have happened in the world, I would have maybe received plus minus 4% in each world, because Coca-Cola is less reactive to the overall economy, for example. So how can I provide a measurement for this variability of this asset? I already came up with a measure of return. This is my expected return of 8.1%. And now I can say, let's just look at the individual world, for example, Corona world. And look, if I would live in that world, I would have 15% return, which would deviate from my expectation of 8% by 23%. Now I'll go to the next one. Business as usual. I would have a return of 10%, but I only expected 8, so I would deviate from my expectation by 2%. In the manager leaving world, I would deviate also by 2%, but by minus 2%, and so on. So I can also, for each world, take the delta to my expectation and take this average. And this would give me a number of BMW's volatility of all these possible worlds. So that was the expected return, and now the risk, what I just explained. So that's what's called the variance. So I just take the return that I would actually realize in this world, and subtract the expected return to get the difference, and then I weigh it by the probability that this world is materializing. And of course, I squared it too, so I don't, so negative and positive returns don't cancel each other out, for me to assume that there's no volatility while there actually is. And to get a standardized measure of this risk, I would just take the square root to get the standard deviation. And you can also watch a YouTube tutorial on standard deviation or expected return. Doesn't sound right. Okay, so what would I have done as a global investor? I would have come up with an expected return for BMW with 8% and an associated risk with 3%. So I assume that I will receive 8% plus minus 3%. And according to Markowitz portfolio theory, you would do this kind of calculation for every asset there is, not just for BMW, so that in the end you would come up with an expected return and a standard deviation or expected standard deviation for every possible investment. Now, if you want to decide in what to invest, you don't have to invest everything in one company. You can also mix your assets and build portfolios. For example, you could build this portfolio number 1 and invest in those 4 companies, or this portfolio number 2 or 3, indefinite number of portfolios you could invest. And if you have a portfolio, for example, this portfolio 2, and you know that it includes 30% of Bayersdorf and 70% of Coca-Cola, then you can easily calculate the expected return of this portfolio by just taking 30% of the expected return of Bayersdorf and 70% of the expected return of Coca-Cola. Now, if you want to calculate the standard deviation of the portfolio, it's not as easy. You cannot just take 30% of the standard deviation of company A and 70% of the standard deviation of Coca-Cola. Because think about it, if you would have a portfolio and there's an airline company and an oil company, and now oil prices go down. For example, what would happen to the oil company? The share price of the oil company will go down because they would receive lower prices. But the share price of the airline company will most likely go up because they can pay less money for their kerosene. So what will happen is one will go a little bit up, one will go a little bit down, but altogether on the portfolio view, they won't move as much. So whenever you have a portfolio where there are assets that don't 100% move into the same direction all the time, then the variance will cancel each other out a little bit. And that's why you calculate the standard deviation depending on the correlation on how one moves, depending on how one asset in the portfolio moves in relation to the other assets in the portfolio. And I mean, this is not as important now. I just want to give you the intuition, but you just you take the standard deviation of all the assets and you adjust for the weight, and you also adjust for the correlation of them. And the interesting thing here is that because you do this, because you combine assets in portfolios that don't 100% move just exactly the same way, that's how you can reduce risk. This you can see, for example, in portfolio 1, you have the expected return of 7%, just like at Commerzbank at the top, but you have less standard deviation, so you have less risk while having the same expected return. And that's the essence of Markowitz portfolio theory. And it's the only free lunch, so to speak, in finance, that by diversifying, you can reduce risk. And it makes absolutely sense. I mean, even if you have one company that you love so much and that you think will go over the top to the moon, it still doesn't make sense to invest all your money in it because you don't know the future. What if something very, very, very unlikely happens to this company then you will lose everything. You're better off picking many companies that you like, and then 1 out of 10 will just have bad luck and you won't be losing everything. So on the bottom left here, I summarized just what I just said. So fluctuations in the return of my portfolio due to company-specific risks can be reduced through diversification. Yeah, put it in these words. So the portfolio theory asks the question, how does a global investor decide in what to do, in what to invest? And it gives the answer that the investor builds an efficient portfolio with risky assets. So the investor builds an opinion about risk and return profiles of all these different assets, and then he allocates them together as to reduce the risk based on a specific return he wants to have. That's all there is to the portfolio theory. It's really common sense. You diversify risky, you put risky assets together, and you diversify and reduce the overall risk that you're exposed to. And in my next video, I'm going to give an intuitive explanation about the capital asset pricing model, the CAPM, which is based on Markowitz portfolio theory. And the CAPM answers the question based on an individual company, such as BMW, for example. How much return does this company has to provide to possible shareholders for them to buy their shares in the first place? Or from the viewpoint of the company, how high is my cost of equity?